the ruling by the European Court for Human Rights yesterday is widely celebrated, or has been widely celebrated by South Africans and fans of Caster Semenya worldwide. And this is giving her, it's understood, a chance to now fight, or second chance to fight against the testosterone rules that were put in place by World Athletics a few years ago, actually in 2018, then called IAAF, perceived to be targeted specifically at Caster Semenya. And I'm joined by one of the people who's been fighting that Caster Semenya battle, Ross Tucker, who's a sports scientist. Ross, we've taken a look at the legal side of things. We've taken a look at the human rights side of things. And we just want to talk scientifically at this point and what the genesis of the issue was between World Athletics and Caster Semenya. Let's start here. What is the argument brought forward by World Athletics against Caster Semenya, or athletes, as they say, athletes with DSD?
Yeah, sure. So it's important to stress it's not Semenya, it's athletes with DSD, and there are now, even since Semenya, there have been a handful. Before her, there were a few others, and in the court proceedings, it was revealed there have been about 30 in the last 10 years. So it's not unique to Semenya, and that idea that it was targeted towards her, I don't think is true. The issue is this, is that in sport, women have a category that is separate from men for important biological reasons. They, as females, do not have hormones that males have, namely testosterone. And the consequence of not having testosterone is that females perform at a different level in sport. They don't get the same muscle mass, the fat mass, the strength, the power, the endurance. And so we have a category for women athletes that is separate and closed off to people who have that male advantage. And the challenge that sports have with athletes with DSDs is that they are in fact biologically males. So they have chromosomes of males, they have testes, they produce high levels of testosterone, but they have other conditions that cause them not to develop as typical males, and so instead they're identified when they're born as girls. But then they bring across these male advantages into women's sports. And so what World Athletics said back in 2019 is that if a person like that, with these very high levels of testosterone, by virtue of being biologically male, wants to compete in women's sport, they have to lower their hormone levels in order to make it fair. And that's the challenge that's the policy that Semenya challenged, and of course lost the case at CAS and subsequently the appeals. And winning this case now is in a sense a moral victory. It's not a victory against the policy. It's more a victory against the process that says that she had no reasonable way to challenge that policy in the first place.
And is it possible then, Ross, that we could, for a moment, take off our South African hats and hearts and look at it from the perspective of World Athletics? Do they have an argument in terms of fairness when you speak of the certain advantages that they have with developing as males in some parts? Do they have an added advantage? Speaking of muscle mass and all of that, does World Athletics have an argument, scientifically speaking?
Yeah, I hate to say it, but they do. And in fact, it's a very strong argument in terms of the biology, at least. There are areas where World Athletics' position is a little bit weaker, but on the biology, it's actually very good. And the position is that when you have the condition that we've seen, not only again in Semenya, but in a number of other athletes, you have normal levels of testosterone for a male. You have every normal opportunity to make use of that testosterone. And so for all intents and purposes, the development of that person through childhood and then into young adulthood and adolescence is exactly the same as that of any other male. And so the performance advantage would have to be assessed as if it were entirely male. That was fundamental to the Court of Arbitration proceedings back in 2019. They had a lengthy debate about whether these conditions meant that someone had normal or typical male advantage, and they concluded that they did, because there's no evidence at all that they don't. So in reality, it is a strong position, and I know that's not a popular opinion with South Africans, but the fact is that again, why does women's sport exist? And biologically, the answer is it's there to exclude male factors like testosterone. And when athletes have those, sport has to kind of do something, otherwise it undermines the purpose and the meaning of women's sports. So World Athletics was in a difficult situation. They created a policy that doesn't solve the problem. They thought it was the best thing. Other people viewed it from the other perspective and thought it was discrimination.
And Ross, just as a parting shot, height, you could argue, well, it's not even arguable. Height is also a biological advantage when it comes to players who take on basketball, who play in the NBA, and they are encouraged, in fact, to actually take on basketball because of their height. Does that not then nullify some of the or parts of the argument here to say, well, me being taller is...
I just lost you in there. Sorry, you were asking, does that not...
Yes, the same way as I hope you can hear me now. Does that then not still give me an added advantage? And there's nothing I can do about that. I happened to be born taller, and I cannot be crucified for that.
Yeah, it does, but let me sort of counter that with two questions. Number one is, there's no doubt height matters for basketball. Has there ever been a female in the NBA, even though they're a tall woman? So what is it that stops women from competing in basketball, even though you do get tall women? So I'd say that the effect of biological sex overwhelms the effect of height, even when height matters. And the other thing is that you must remember there's no category for height in sport. It's not like we have a basketball competition for people who are taller than 1.8 and people who are shorter than 1.8. But if we did, let's say, for argument's sake, we did that, and someone came along and they were 183, but they want to play in the short competition, would we allow it or not? And the answer is no, because once you create a category, you have to then defend that category. So you could argue that it's arbitrary, that we shouldn't have a category for men separate from women, in the same way that we shouldn't have a category for tall people separate from short. But the reality is that, you know, in sports like running, the best times that we see from women are beaten every year by thousands of boys and men. You know, that's how big that difference is. And no other factor, whether it's height, whether it's the length of your arms in swimming, whether it's your metabolism or your neurobiology, no other factor comes close to giving someone what biological sex gives to males as an advantage. That's why it exists as a category. So think rather of mass in boxing. You know, you don't let heavyweights fight against lightweights, because we know that mass makes a massive difference, and that's how it works with biological sex. So the sport was in an impossible situation. They wanted to be inclusive, no doubt, but you can't. That's the reality. You cannot have inclusion of athletes and fairness at the same time. It has to be a choice. South Africans will choose inclusion. World Athletics chose fairness.
Yeah, and that's ultimately what it's been all about this entire time, Ross, whether we need to promote inclusiveness or promote fairness. And it's difficult to see how you can achieve both. As you say, it's actually hard to see how it can be achieved. Ross Tucker is a sports scientist talking to us there about some of the nitty-gritties in this Caster Semenya case. We would have loved to have spoken a lot more, Ross, but unfortunately we're desperately out of time.